This is Washington's farewell address. He gave it right before giving up power in the Oval Office. And in it, he says something that's very important and very much pertains to the times that we're living in. He said, "Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of the party generally. This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its roots in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or oppressed, but in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. The alternate dominion of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism." There has been a lot of turmoil over the last couple of days for the American people. School shootings, assassinations, and just this enormous amount of divisiveness online, especially. The kind of decisiveness that Washington, in his farewell address, literally warns us about. And just like everyone else, I've kind of been glued to the news for the past couple of days. There's been a lot going on, and it seems to be a strange coincidence to me that at the same time, I've been reading Ron Chernow's Washington biography and just learning about his life and the founding of this great country. And honestly, I've just been kind of having my mind blown because it's crazy how often we fail to learn from history. And it's even crazier how much of the problems that we're facing today, Washington has warned us about before. Before technology advanced as much as it did, before World War II, before the Civil War, before the Industrial Revolutions, Washington warned us about the problems that we're going through today. And it's really crazy because no one really seems to be paying attention to this at all. So I wanted to make this video and get it out there as fast as possible. No B-roll, very little editing, and just go over about some of the warnings that Washington gave us, how to overcome them, and just overall how he would see the country that we're living in today if he were here. So yeah, that's it. Let's get into it. So first up is factions. Washington hated factions. A faction is like a subgroup within a bigger group, but the way Washington uses it, it means more like a political party. So just know that whenever I say faction, you can pretty much replace the word political party and it'll mean the same thing. His feelings for factions pretty much started when he was president, when the first two major political parties were forming. On one side, you have Hamilton leading the Federalists, and on the other side, you have Thomas Jefferson leading the Democratic Republicans. And the only thing you have to know about these two people is that they hated each other. Like, they seriously hated each other. They argued all the time. They disagreed on almost everything, on immigration, on the banking system, on how much power the government should have. And there was just a lot of arguing in a lot of the debates that they had. If you've ever watched the musical Hamilton, it actually does a pretty good job at portraying the relationship that they had. Anyway, in the very beginning, Washington didn't even want factions. He didn't want political parties. He didn't want sides forming or any of that. And Ron Chernow, in the biography, he writes, "Washington and other founders entertained the fanciful hope that America would be spared the bane of political parties, which they called factions, and associated with parochial self-interest." So obviously this didn't happen. Political parties formed, and Washington was like right there, stuck in the middle, and he just hated it. He was stuck right in between Hamilton and Jefferson. Ron Chernow describes that Washington saw these political parties as the mortal poison to our land. And this was for a very good reason. He had studied history a lot, and he knew that over time, these two political parties would come to care more about winning than about the survival of the Republic. A very good example of this would be the fall of the Roman Republic after Julius Caesar got assassinated. After he got assassinated, there was a huge grab for power. It was a huge civil war between Mark Antony and Octavian, and it all culminated up to the Battle of Actium, where Octavian took full control and he made himself the emperor. And that was the end of the Roman Republic and the start of the Roman Empire. For Washington, things got ugly in a bit of a different way, and that's because even though he tried to stay in the middle, he still had to take sides sometimes, and most times he was on the Federalist sides on Hamilton's side. Thomas Jefferson obviously did not like this at all, and he secretly started funding a newspaper called the National Gazette, which was constantly attacking Washington, making him look weak, making him look like he was too monarchical and he wanted to be king and he wanted all the power. And Washington really didn't like this. He was a huge person of honor, and he believed very much in wanting to leave a strong legacy. And so because he knew that these writings would stick around for a long time, it was very disappointing to him. Ron Chernow says about this that he was astounded at the abuse hurled at him by the partisan press, and that he lamented the venomous spirit that faction had unleashed. He dealt with these types of problems for pretty much his entire presidency, and even in his farewell address, he says something very important about how much he hated this experience of having to deal with factions and not being able to stay in the middle. He said, "The spirit of the party serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, and foments riots and insurrections." So this is super chilling for two reasons. One, because it's complete chaos in a place where there's supposed to be order, and two, because this mentality is the exact type of thing that's happening today, and he's literally warning us about it. What he calls the bad side of factions, the sort of mob mentality, is exactly what people are feeding into today. And I'm not even trying to take a side politically here because it's happening on both sides, but that's exactly the point. I think if Washington were here today, he would be completely astounded at the amount that people pour themselves into these different factions, into these different political parties, at completely dehumanizing the other side and not fighting until there's unity, but fighting until their side wins. And even during Washington's time, there was the same problem. People forgot that it wasn't Federalists against Democratic Republicans, but it was the United States. Not two parties, but one country. Of course, he would probably have different opinions on different topics, just like everyone. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But I really do think that if Washington were here, he would do his best to be that middle guy, that middle ground in between Jefferson and Hamilton, in between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and just really be that rock solid foundation for people. He would prioritize union over any faction that's looking to win. So this next point I think is going to speak to Washington's character the best, because it really is his character that made him so great. It really is his character that made him the leader that he was. Of course, he had his faults. I'm not going to pretend like he was the perfect guy. He was a slave owner. But when it came to leadership, it's his strengths that really shone. His honesty and his calmness, and I think most importantly is his honor. You see, Washington had this sort of weight on his shoulders, a sort of weight of holding himself to extremely high standards, and he would use these extremely high standards on the people around him as well. And this sort of leads me to the idea of civic virtue. Civic virtue refers to the moral habits and personal qualities that promote the good of the community and the effective functioning of a society, requiring citizens to put the common good above self-interest. Now, those last couple words are super, super important. The citizens are required to put the common good above the self-interest. This really is the most difficult thing in the world to do, yet it is the key to having a thriving civilization, and Washington knew this. He embodied civic virtue in a way that I think is just truly one in a million. And I mean, one of the shining moments in history was when he chose to step down from the Oval Office and give up power to show the people that there could be a peaceful transition of power. I mean, people at this point loved him. They would allow him to do anything. They probably would allow him to crown himself king if he wanted to. And so when he did give up power, when he didn't try to take a third term, it was sort of this ultimate form of civic virtue. He was giving up power for the sake of something bigger, for the good of the whole, for the sake of the republic. And he believed that everyone should take it upon themselves to do that, to hold themselves to a personal high standard of honor that put the good of the whole instead of the good of themselves. Once again, I will say that this is the only way to build a strong society or a strong civilization, because if there's not this sense of a whole community of structure, then the whole thing kind of just dissolves and collapses into chaos. Okay, great. Not put Washington in today's position. Now, I'm not going to say that civic virtue is completely gone, because I mean, society would be completely gone. But I will say that there seems to be a sort of I'm just focused on myself mentality that's going around. And I mean, honestly, I don't really blame anyone for this. I mean, it's hard to even go to the store to buy eggs. It's hard to trust the authorities when there are so many scandals happening. It is hard to be a human person in the society that we're living in right now. But the point is that even during trying times, as soon as civic virtue crumbles, then society crumbles as well. And so it's better to have civic virtue and not make things worse for ourselves than the alternative. If you don't have people who are willing to put the good of the whole over the good of themselves sometimes, then you eventually get to a point where you have an entire nation that's not really a nation, but just a whole group of just individuals. And once again, it always goes back to Washington's main point about factions, because Washington understood that you have to feel like you're part of the group, like you're part of the whole, like you're part of something bigger, the republic. He understood very, very, very deeply that a house divided falls, but a house united can do anything. You can sort of see factions when it comes to the riots that have been going on recently. recently. And again, I don't mean this for any sides. This isn't about sides. This is about unity. But Washington saw anarchy as one of the nation's biggest threats. And he knew that when you see people acting on self-interest, on impulse, and when it comes to riots on passion, obviously, he would know that it's a sign of a society that's on the brink of collapse and something needs to be done. And so in times like these, it's good to have someone like Washington who's just screaming unity even when everyone's just trying to fight each other. I mean, this is literally what we remember Abraham Lincoln for. Of course, he's known for the abolition of slavery, but I think even on top of that, accomplishing that feat while keeping the House united, while keeping the United States together, even after a civil war, is just absolutely mind-blowing, and it deserves to be recognized. Washington actually dealt with a lot of riots and very similar things as well in his time. In 1783, a huge amount of the Continental Army that hadn't been paid from the war decided to revolt against the government and take over so that they can make their money, so that they can get paid. Washington knew that if a civilian army turned against the government, then the republic was just over. Like, it was just gone. You cannot devolve into violence. And so he rode out to them. He called a meeting with them. And when he spoke to them, he put on his spectacles and he said, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind." This is one of the most beautiful moments in history ever, because that single sentence ended the soon-to-be riot. The idea of betraying someone who fought for them and who fought with them was just like completely not on the table for them. And so these people took on the civic virtue that Washington asked them to take on, and they left to sacrifice for the good of the whole. That is one of the most important messages ever told. And it's also one of the greatest motivators. It was only because Washington had sacrificed so much for his country that these men saw his sacrifice, they saw his pain and how much he had given away. And it was because of this, because they saw this noble act in front of them, that they turned away and took on their own civic virtue. So taking on that responsibility and doing those acts also inspires the people around you to do that as well. Washington knew that there is a very thin line between republic and ruin, especially in the beginning when the government was extremely fragile. And if you were here today, I'm sure that he would argue that no cause as of yet justifies the violence against constitutional authority. And I'll just repeat the main lesson from this section, that putting your own self-interest behind the good of the whole is absolutely necessary, and not just necessary, but you also get repaid with a flourishing society. When the society that you build up, you know you have had a part to play in that. And I think the men in the Continental Army knew that, Washington knew that, and it's just like this message that you can get from Washington that it's really hard to see the potency anywhere else in history besides this. So that leads us to the next point. There seems to be a growing amount of violence in the world, and I know it's kind of ironic to talk about this because Washington was the guy who led a revolution, and it was a violent revolution. But that doesn't mean that he was always in favor of bloodshed. He understood that there's a very big difference between taking power and defending liberty. And I think to Washington, it's not actually violence that defends liberty, but it's defending freedom of speech. When the Americas began rioting against British rule, it was only because they were being taxed without representation and they weren't being given seats in parliament to actually speak for themselves. Their freedom of speech was being taken away, and so they were forced to violence. Washington wrote, "If men are to be precluded from offering their sentiments on a matter, the freedom of speech it may be taken away, and dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter." And so sometimes it's worth thinking about whether you need a revolution or whether you just need a voice. To Washington, the only way to truly kill freedom is to just silence the citizen, because in his eyes, the citizen should have the power. The citizen should have the right to vote, the right to speak up, the right to be informed. But there's a couple external factors that also sort of influence civilian control, and Washington hated these factors. The first one is money. Washington just hated greed. There's a lot of writings about this. During the Revolutionary War at Valley Forge, the colonist troops actually were having a very rough time feeding themselves. And this was in large part due because the farmers around them weren't selling to them because their currency was devalued. And so they were selling their food to the British troops because the British currency was valued higher. Washington absolutely hated this because these farmers were profiteering off of war, and they were putting money over the lives of their own people, the colonists. This sparks a very important conversation about patriotism versus greed. And if you can't tell, it always goes back to the concept of civic virtue. Should the farmers be focused on making profit for themselves, or should they take one for the team? Should they sacrifice and take the devaluated currency for the good of the whole? To Washington, it wasn't just greed to take the former, but it was a literal betrayal to the colonists. So take that exact same scenario and put that in modern context, because the exact same thing is still going on today. There are corporations who profit off of war, of course, but there are also corporations that profit off of pandemics. There are corporations who profit even off of political violence. Washington understood how difficult it was to get the incentives right, to get people to actually put the good of the whole over the good of themselves, and he would definitely try to combat this problem in some way with incentives. The second factor is weapons, armed men. He knew firsthand about the danger of people with arms, and pretty much for his entire life he dealt with all these mutinies and rebellions trying to go up against him. Unfortunately, you're starting to see more and more of this in modern times. Even if it's not groups of people, even single individuals can do a lot of destruction by themselves. So what would he think of that? Well, we don't even have to guess with this one. He literally said, all obstructions to the execution of the laws are destructive of this fundamental principle and of fatal tendency. And he also said, the unity of the government is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. So I'm just going to leave that point there. No one is above the law, and it's very clear that government supported the government keeping order, the citizens holding power, and any sort of anti-anarchical movement of factions. What that pretty much means is that he liked order over chaos, and if you're trying to build or rebuild a nation, you definitely need it. So Washington was not super religious, especially in the sense of like what you would normally traditionally think of a religious person, but he was very traditional. He was a Freemason, and a lot of the Freemason values sort of infiltrated his morality. He was someone who always showed a lot of restraints, a lot of this sort of cool calmness, a very ritualistic person, and he showed just a huge amount of discipline in his life. Even though he did attend church sometimes, he rarely took communion, and he was very pragmatic about his faith, meaning that it was all very logical. So even though he didn't fully commit to any religion, he still understood the importance of it. About religion, he said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. So it was sort of like, even though he didn't believe in the literal interpretations of certain texts, he still knew the importance and the value of them in society. And he even said in his first inaugural address that the propitious smile of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. And the key wording here is eternal rules of order. He understood that in order for there to be a thriving civilization, there has to be a sort of set of rules, an eternal rule of order. And having the masses believe in a sort of religion or morality is a part of that. Napoleon knew this very well as well. I'm just going to mention Napoleon in every video. It's not even worth it trying to keep him out of my mouth. And I'm going to get cooked for that too. The point is that without this underlying unity of beliefs, society collapses. And so it's really that underlying unity of beliefs that Washington really cared about for building the nation. One thing that he did really care about was a sort of providence, a sort of like a fate or destiny. He actually spoke of providence guiding the revolution, and he just believed that there were bigger forces at play with the Revolutionary War. And on a certain level, he was making a lot of decisions on a moral pretense. He even said, the establishment of our new government seemed to be the last great experiment for promoting human happiness. So he still understood the importance of having that underlying morality, even calling it a sort of indispensable support. It's a necessary part of building a functioning society, and he knew that. And so I think if you put him in today's place, he would be a little bit shocked and astounded at the empty churches, or even this problem that there's not really a third place to go to. He might take it as a sign that the principles that once held us together are now fading away. And I think he would also definitely notice that people just don't seem to trust the authorities anymore. And that's a very important part, because people need to be able to trust the government and believe that they have the power in order for it to work. And people just currently don't. They feel powerless. They feel like the power doesn't lie with them, that everything is corrupt. And so when you lose the sense of structure, that underlying morality, the principle that's sort of the glue that holds everyone together, you sort of turn to a group, your own group. And that sort of leads me to the first point about factions. What is the main problem that Washington has warned us about? It's factions. It's the divisiveness that comes from factions, and that's what Washington was really worried about, because the country can get through anything as long as it's united. And it's just not. It's divided and it's decisive. And the great founder of this country warned us about that, warned us about factions, warned us about that divisiveness. And so as I'm wrapping up the video, I'd like to read this quote once again from his farewell address that really just shows everything that he was warning us about. "Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in its strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed, but in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness, and is truly their worst enemy. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism, but this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism." Guys, I love this country. My parents are immigrant. I am so grateful to be here, to be in the land of opportunities, in the land of the free. And even though I'm not much of a people person, I'd more just like to stay in my room and, read biographies and stuff. But I still love the people here, left or right, Republican or Democrat. It doesn't matter. It's not about sides, it is about unity. And I think that's the biggest takeaway I can take from Washington, just unity and union and civic virtue. And I can't see a bleak future with those qualities in all of us. So anyway, that's it. Thank you for watching. I'm not plugging another video today. I just wanted to get this one out there as soon as possible. And yeah, that's it. See ya.